Spiky hair, distressed clothes, safety pins, not being able to sing, and people being angry about stuff. These elements make up an average person's understanding of punk. However, if you've clicked on this video, I suspect you're not the type of person who thinks paying this guy for a selfie in Camden Town is the pinnacle of what the punk subculture has to offer, and I assume that you are somewhat aware of how groundbreaking and influential this movement was in the latter half of the 20th century. Like a lot of subcultures, punk was born out of music, and despite being notorious for simplistic instrumentation and abrasive vocals, it went on to be incredibly influential. The same can be said of punk fashion. Ever since the late 70s, the fashion industry has had an affair with the punk aesthetic, which many deem controversial, as a lot of what punk is supposedly meant to rebel against is epitomized by the fashion industry. This pisses people off even more when they find out that high fashion brands specifically love to get their grubby little mitts on the aesthetic. This has led to some brands selling typical looking DIY punk clothes for some pretty eye-watering prices. Ugh, Sid Vicious would be rolling in his grave at the idea of high fashion infiltrating and perverting the sacred, anti-establishment, anti-conformity holy grail that is punk. Wait, who made the clothes for the Sex Pistols again? Yeah, as you can see, this is a complicated subject with a lot of layers. While there are definitely cases of punk being mishandled and bastardized by the fashion industry, there are also a number of designers who have really progressed fashion in new and interesting ways and have heavily influenced how people dress, all off the back of punk influence. To understand all of this, we need to go back to the 70s when it all began, and despite common assumption, it did not originate from the UK. America is where we will be starting this journey. Despite how wise, knowledgeable, insightful, and good at reading Wikipedia I am, I can't really be bothered to go in depth and explain the context and early influences that resulted in this American pioneered music scene, seeing as at this point, fashion was yet to be intertwined with the unrealized punk subculture. However, what is important is when the proto-punk genre started to emerge. As the name implies, the proto-punk categorization exists purely to denote the bands and artists who foreshadowed the birth of punk and does not indicate a common sound or musical style as most types of genres do. Instead, it refers more to the rebellious energy and attitudes that these musical acts would exude. The best example I can present without using copyrighted music is Iggy Pop of Iggy and the Stooges, who were a seminal proto-punk group. Iggy Pop was notorious for his chaotic energy and crazy onstage behaviour, which would be emulated and built upon by not only future punk acts, but also artists from many other genres. I mean, a lot of people consider this man to be the pioneer of the stage dive. So basically, Iggy jumped so that Playboi Carti could front flip. And I guess so Gigi Allen could shit himself on stage somewhere in between on this timeline, but anyway, I digress. The New York CBGB venue is considered to be the place where the rough proto-punk gem became the still very rough and unpolished punk jewel. Many proto-punk acts and pioneering punk bands famously performed at this New York venue, but for now we will be focusing on the New York Dolls, who in terms of fashion actually had a glam rock look. During the mid-70s, around the time the band would have done shows at the CBGB venue, they were briefly managed by an Englishman by the name of Malcolm McLaren. In between dressing up the New York Dolls and getting them to perform in front of a certain hammer and sickle flag that America famously really likes, Malcolm would scope out other musical acts within the New York punk scene. One man in particular caught his eye, Richard Hell from the band Television, who had a very unique personal style that featured spiky hair and ripped clothes with DIY elements. Malcolm's reaction to this look was, "Yeah, gimme that," and immediately hopped on a plane back to England, where he planned to act on the inspiration gained from his trip across the pond. Once back from New York, Malcolm McLaren wanted to rebrand the West London-based boutique run by him and his girlfriend called Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die to the name Sex. From a modern perspective, this might seem like a try-hard or even childish way of trying to make the shop seem rebellious, but at the time it was a very provocative move and the local neighbourhood was not very happy. For context, the shop was in Chelsea, which is famously one of the poshest boroughs in the whole of London. There is even a reality TV show about the average Chelsea resident's lifestyle if you ever want to watch the most insufferable, privileged and out-of-touch Londoners pretend their relationships aren't scripted by Channel 4 producers. The shop had rebranded a number of times and had been very successful in selling clothes that catered towards the rock and teddy boys style. The American pioneered punk movement had started to pick up steam in the UK, so Sex aimed to sell clothes catered to that audience along with fetish and bondage wear. McLaren had realised that with so many music fans trying to emulate the fashion of their idols, it could be a very lucrative endeavour to create a band that was dressing clothes sold by his boutique. In his own words, we decided we needed mannequins to model our clothes, and so we invented the Sex Pistols. As most people already know, the Sex Pistols became extremely iconic and pioneered the UK punk look, which is also considered to be the standard or traditional style of the genre. The person responsible for designing the fashion of the Sex Pistols and a lot of, if not most of the clothes sold at Sex was Malcolm's girlfriend, also known as Vivienne Westwood. Vivienne Isabel Swire was born in the English county of Derbyshire in 1941. Her father was a cobbler and her mother worked in the local mill as a fabric weaver. At 17, her family moved to the Harrow borough of London, where she worked at a local factory and then later enrolled at a teacher training school. Vivienne married a man named Derek Westwood, from whom she took her surname. She gave birth to her first son Ben and started a seemingly normal life as a primary school teacher. However, this would all change in the late 60s. Before then, she had actually completed a single term of a jewellery and silversmithing course at the Harrow Art School, but she dropped out saying, "I didn't know how a working class girl like me could possibly make a living in the art world." Despite her teaching career, she still stayed a creative person as she made jewellery which she would sell at Portobello Market, and she even made her own dress for her first wedding. After her divorce from Derek, she met Malcolm McLaren, who was an art student friend of her brother. She initially wasn't interested in him, especially as, according to Vivienne, he did not look after himself. Essentially, Malcolm was a bit of a slob who would not stop pursuing her romantically. She began to pity him and, as a result, started to do stuff like cook for him, among other things a mother would likely do for a child. At one point, Malcolm fell ill and didn't own a bed, so Vivienne let him sleep on her one during the daytime while he got over his fever. However, he just refused to leave and was there for days, which resulted in Vivienne getting pregnant and the start of their relationship. For any impressionable man-child slobs watching this, please do not try to do this. Despite what 4chan probably tells you, this is not what we call W-Riz. Anyway, despite all of this, she would later say, "I latched onto Malcolm as somebody who opened doors for me." Vivienne would go on to stock the shelves of Sex and all previous iterations of the boutique with her designs. At first, she was mainly making graphic print clothes with extremely provocative and controversial designs. However, these weren't just purely for shock value, and most of them had a political message behind them. Being politically outspoken is not only inherent to punk, but also to Vivienne herself, as she would famously partake in activism throughout her whole life. In fact, the choice of making clothes like this that were more aligned with the punk scene was part of Vivienne and Malcolm wanting to distance themselves and their boutique from the Teddy Boys scene, which at the time had started to become notoriously racist. This also led to the shop being renamed to Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die, and then a year later to Sex, to further align with the growing punk scene in the UK. Vivienne continued to make controversial graphic print clothing, but also started to incorporate distressing and bondage elements. The shop became extremely successful as it gained a community of young, rebellious fashion enthusiasts who largely felt disenfranchised by the political and economic state of the UK during the mid to late 70s. This now leads us to the formation of the Sex Pistols. Many people believe Malcolm McLaren formed the band from scratch in a modern build-a-boy band style like Simon Cowell did with One Direction, but this isn't completely the case. The band was originally formed under the name The Strand in 1972 by friends Steve Jones, Paul Cook, and Wally Nightingale. Steve Jones would spend a lot of his time stealing things, especially musical equipment. This is how he and his mates gained the instruments to start their band. He would often frequent Malcolm McLaren's boutique, and despite his shoplifting tendencies, the two would become friends. Malcolm became the manager of the Strand, but not without making some major executive decisions to reshape it. Other than changing the name, he also kicked out the bass player Wally Nightingale purely because he wore glasses which did not fit into the look Malcolm had envisioned for the band. This betrayal would haunt Wally for years to come, especially considering the eventual success of the band. Unfortunately for him, this was a pre-Weezer era, so being a specky four-eyed neek wasn't considered to be cool yet. Malcolm replaced Wally with one of the employees at Sex called Glenn Matlock, who later on would be replaced by Sid Vicious. During the hunt for a frontman, Malcolm auditioned a customer in the shop who wasn't very good at singing, but he had presence and looked the part, which was Malcolm's priority. The customer's name was John Lydon, and he became the singer of the Sex Pistols and was nicknamed Johnny Rotten due to his decaying teeth. The Sex Pistols would always wear Vivienne's designs for shows and other public appearances, and just as Malcolm planned, this resulted in a lot of good business for Sex, but also the band went on to be one of the most influential music acts to come out of the UK in the 70s and essentially spearheaded the UK punk scene that appeared like an avalanche following their rise to fame. Despite their impact, the Sex Pistols did not last long and had broken up by 1978. Following this, Malcolm and Vivienne decided to rename the boutique once more to World's End and focus more on making Vivienne an established designer. This is when we saw her first runway collection, which was shown in London in 1981 called Pirate, and as expected had a pirate theme. Other than referencing historic clothes, this very flamboyant collection also drew inspiration from the New Romantic's post-punk fashion and music scene that was gaining popularity at the time, with Vivienne's clothes from this collection further pushing its reach. Adam Mant, who was a musician from the New Romantic scene, was also a past employee at the Sex Boutique. As Vivienne further honed her craft as a designer and presented more clothes to the boutique, she started to rely on Malcolm less and less. Their relationship started to crumble in 1982, with Vivienne saying he started to become very jealous and would refer to her as just a seamstress instead of a designer, along with trying to claim credit for her entire career. The couple parted ways, and the autumn-winter 1983 Witches Runway collection was their last official collaboration. Following the breakup, Vivienne kept the shop but changed the label to her eponymous brand, Vivienne Westwood. Despite stating that for a long time she felt like just an interpreter of Malcolm's ideas, she would further gain notoriety as a designer and even received an invitation to show her Spring-Summer 1984 Hypnose collection in Japan at Hane Mori's Best of 5 Global Fashion Awards. This continued into the 90s when she won the Women's Wear Designer of the Year award from the British Fashion Council in both 1990 and 1991. To cut a long story short, Vivienne Westwood went on to become a household name and one of the greatest designers to come out of the UK. Despite some of her most iconic work criticising the monarchy, she would go on to accept an OBE award in 1992. For my non-British viewers who likely don't know what this is, it's essentially a pat on the back from the reptile family who live here. During the ceremony, she famously did a twirl for the press to show off her outfit and accidentally flashed the photographers. Yeah, apparently wearing underwear is not a part of the dress code for these sorts of events. She has actually been fined for indecent exhibition, but that was back in 1975 alongside Malcolm McLaren due to some of the explicit designs being sold in the Sex Boutique. Fortunately for Vivienne, there was no repercussions for her blunder, and apparently the Queen even found it amusing, but I guess she was notorious for turning a blind eye to freaky behaviour. Luckily, Vivienne didn't make the same mistake in 2006 when her OBE was advanced to Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, otherwise known as Damehood. While the Vivienne Westwood brand is British through and through, it's also managed to find a second home in a different island nation on the other side of the world. Japan was the first country to receive a Vivienne Westwood boutique outside of the UK. This happened during the 80s in Tokyo. While the country is famous for conformity, with the phrase, "the nail that sticks out gets hammered down," being almost a slogan for the nation, the Japanese youth at the time latched onto the punk aesthetic. Vivienne's influence and presence in Japanese fashion becomes extremely apparent when you look into the Harajuku style of the 90s and noughties. Luckily, this street style era has been immortalized by Fruits magazine. If you're watching this video, you likely already know the significance of the Harajuku style, but for the people who don't, it's considered to be street fashion styling at its most creative and self-expressive, and is often brought up as evidence of the claim that Tokyo is the fashion capital of the world and does it better than everywhere else. This is a statement I definitely agree with, but Paris, Milan, New York, Copenhagen and London are often debated in this conversation too. I'm not going to get sidetracked and start debating and critiquing the fashion game of all these cities, as most of them I haven't even lived in, let alone visited, but for London, come on now. Until I'm getting mugged or my phone snatched by someone dressed like this instead of this, London's not even in the conversation. Anyway, the Harajuku style ethos is very similar to punk in the way that it was very much about non-conformity and self-expression, which I guess was already on the rise due to the breakthrough of Japanese anti-fashion titans such as Rei Kawakubo and Yohji Yamamoto in the 80s. So maybe Japan's fashion landscape was just in the right conditions around the 80s and 90s, where subversive designs and non-conformity sentiments led to punk aesthetics and values becoming popular. This could explain why Vivienne Westwood's designs were heavily favoured, as she was quite literally the pioneer of the most popular and iconic version of punk via the Sex Pistols. Speaking of the Sex Pistols, let's talk about a Japanese tribute band, as that will weirdly bring us to the next section of the video. Sometime in the late 80s, the Tokyo Sex Pistols was formed by a group of Bunker University fashion students who were really into Vivienne Westwood and collecting her clothes. The band members changed over the years, and the involvement of certain members is sort of debated, but supposedly the key people involved were Hikaru Iwanaga, Hiroshi Fujiwara, Tomoaki Nagao, who also goes by the nickname Nigo, and of course Jun Takahashi. As you can see, this tribute band had quite the lineup of individuals who each would probably deserve their own video, but for now, let's focus on the frontman and founder of the band, Jun Takahashi. During his early teens, Jun was exposed to the UK punk scene, likely through music and magazines. This sparked an obsession with the Sex Pistols and Vivienne Westwood, which would later result in the formation of the Tokyo Sex Pistols, and then in 2005, he and Hiroshi Fujiwara would even release a book that displays their personal collections of clothes designed by Vivienne Westwood during her and Malcolm McLaren's shop's Seditionaries era, which was at the height of the Sex Pistols. If you know anything about Jun Takahashi, you'll know that he loves to reference his interests within his work. Sometimes this is done in a copy and paste JPEG onto a garment type of way, and sometimes it's done more creatively. Either way, Jun doesn't need Pinterest to make his inspiration mood boards. He puts those motherfuckers straight on the runway. Punk, however, was not just an aesthetic for Jun. It fundamentally shaped his iconic brand Undercover. Its influence went beyond surface-level references and played a crucial role in the formation of the brand's identity. For starters, the motto of the label is "We make noise, not clothes," which is a clear recontextualization of punk values for a fashion brand. Jun isn't interested in making conventional clothes. Not only is he willing to incorporate subversive themes and references that wouldn't normally be presented in the context of high fashion, but he also likes to make statements with his clothes, and political satire can also be seen within his work. For example, he came up with the slogan "Generation Fuck You" for his Spring-Summer 2000 Undercover collection to critique the economic stagnation that Japan faced during the 90s. This can be at least partly attributed to the slow and inadequate intervention by the Japanese government after the generation prior enjoyed an economic boom, which eventually led to an asset bubble bursting. Jun's willingness to take risks with his designs led to Rei Kawakubo saying he was the only one with courage. As he started making a name for himself in the 90s, the mastermind behind Comme des Garçons noticed his work and the two became acquainted. This eventually led to Rei supporting Jun and not only encouraging him but also helping him with his first collection shown outside of Japan. For Spring-Summer 2003, Jun Takahashi debuted his first Paris runway collection, Scab, which to this day is still considered to be one of Undercover's best and most iconic collections. This is also one of the quintessential examples of punk being displayed on high fashion runways. Jun's main inspiration and reference for this show was the Crust-punk subculture. This branch of punk is famous for its DIY fashion with a heavy focus on sewn-on patches. Jun took this look of super distressed and DIY punk fashion and paired it with sharp tailoring and other elements of high fashion craftsmanship, which was groundbreaking for the Western fashion scene at the time. The show wasn't limited to just referencing the aesthetics of punk, as Jun wanted to include some form of authentic rebellion. This came in the form of the show's finale, which saw a line of models walking in burqas. Obviously, using religious clothing like this is going to be and should be controversial without good reason. However, this seemed to be received positively, at least by the press at the time and retrospective articles, as it was viewed as a critique of the Bush administration's war on terrorism and the subsequent Islamophobia that erupted in the West after 9/11. Here's what US Vogue fashion critic Sarah Moa had to say about this. "I saw Undercover's first show in Paris in 2002, and I will never forget the feeling of what it was like to see burqas as a finale. It was just after 9/11, and you have to remember how we were all scared stiff, depressed, sorrowing, and in fashion circles, not talking about it. So when those multicoloured burqas appeared, it was a complete and utter surprise. Here was a new young designer from Japan, unknown in the West, who was brave enough to be hinting at a subject no one else dared to look at. It didn't feel like he was trying to court controversy or be shocking for the sake of it though. There was something just coming from a completely fresh, non-aggressive viewpoint. There was something gentle, something odd and mysterious about it. While researching this specific subject, I noticed most modern articles talking about the Scab burqas would say Jun intended to directly address 9/11, the military action following, and Islamophobia with these garments, but these explanations seemed suspiciously too Western to me. No shade to Jun, he's obviously a very cultured man, but as I dug a bit deeper, it started to seem like these were more likely interpretations like that of Sarah Moa that over time became viewed as Jun's intentions. There are very few documented conversations with Jun where he directly addresses his use of the burqas, which, as you'll see shortly, are somewhat vague and a bit contradictory, but this is what I could find. Firstly, there is the 2002 issue of Relax magazine, which includes an interview with Jun regarding his 2003 Scab collection. Bear in mind that this interview is in Japanese, so I had to use Google Translate, which isn't always the most reliable. I don't think religions or races or anything like that are an issue at all, and I think that women who wear those kinds of costumes can't show their faces in public, so it's completely gender discrimination. This points towards the use of burqas potentially being a critique of Islam by Jun. The use of burqas in Scab was also discussed by Ellen McLaren in her academic journal article The Burqa in Vogue, Fashioning Afghanistan, which was published in the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies in 2009. She states, when quizzed on his motives, Takahashi has little to say. Many critics try to attribute a political message to his work, and then refers to Takahashi's curated issue of A magazine where he is interviewed about the subject. A quick side note, McLaren claims the interviewer was Terry Jones, the British comedian of the Monty Python troupe. She states this is important as he was known for critiquing the Bush administration and the war in the Middle East. However, Etienne, who runs my clothing archive, pointed out to me that it could have actually been Terry Jones, the founder of ID magazine, which would make far more sense, especially as he authored a book titled 100 Contemporary Fashion Designers, which features Jun Takahashi. But yeah, I don't have access to this issue of A magazine other than what's referenced in the academic journal, so if anyone watching this video does, it would be great if you could confirm which Terry Jones it is in the comments please. But anyway, in this interview, the mysterious Terry Jones asked him if the burqas were connected to post 9/11 sentiments and how it looked like a political comment, to which Jun replies by saying, "It might have looked like I was showing my political message, but that wasn't my intention." It's unclear if he's saying that specifically the post 9/11 political message wasn't his intended message, or he's saying that there wasn't a political message behind it at all. However, in ID magazine issue 229, in an interview with Nicole Full, Jun said regarding the burqas, "I wanted to mix cultural and ethnic stuff to make humans equal for once. I tried to rid the mentality of thoughts of war, so I made an anti-war collection." In McLaren's journal article, she suggests that Jun used the burqas as a punk symbol, saying, "Takahashi undermines the media's incessant connection of the burqa with repression and instead identifies it with punk rebellion against middle-class values," and goes on to draw parallels between the commodification and subsequent devaluing of punk and burqas, but again, this is just another wishy-washy interpretation. I'm aware it seems hilarious that a YouTuber like myself would even attempt to critique an academic journal, but McLaren's questionable identification of Terry Jones, combined with the lack of reference to the Relax magazine interview, where Jun states he believes that burqas represent gender discrimination, leaves me unconvinced with the idea that the burqas were used in the way she claims in her writing. Again, there might be some nuance or meaning lost during the translation of the Relax magazine interview, so take all of this with a grain of salt. On one hand, Jun stated the use of burqas was an anti-war statement, which given the time period would definitely be a response to George Bush's war on terror. Still, then he also denied there being a political message, so it's confusing. The Scab burqas have mostly been viewed as a way of appreciation for this religious garment as beautiful and elegant, in contrast to the general Western perception of burqas, which usually does not perceive it as such. However, Jun's version of the garment is see-through, which completely undermines the purpose of the burqa, which aligns with his comments about gender discrimination. Ultimately, I don't think it's ever going to be clear if Jun was critiquing Islam in some form or not, but I think it's safe to assume that the popular explanation of the use of burqas as a complex response to 9/11, which most modern articles claim, has likely been derived and morphed from his anti-war statement and subsequent interpretations of fashion critics. It is not a be-all end-all explanation and could even be false. Just to reiterate, I am not trying to claim I have unveiled Takahashi's true intentions with the burqas, but instead to point out that the popular explanation is actually a bit of a grey area and presents some possible alternatives based on Jun's actual words. Take all of this with a grain of salt. I am not a journalist, and if you know of any more resources that add more context or even disprove everything I've just said, then please leave a comment. Burqa investigation tangent aside, Scab was an incredibly impactful collection. It's also clear that Jun was incredibly tapped into the crust-punk scene, as many of the genre's references throughout the show were too specific and niche for him to simply be appropriating the subculture without any knowledge or real appreciation for it. One example is the invitation card for the Scab runway show. Printed very faintly over a photograph, you can see the cover of Glaswegian crust-punk band Sedition's 1993 album Earthbeat. The original release of this record came in a screen-printed Hessian sack, which was also referenced by Jun in this collection. The band's vocalist, Angus Quinn, stated in an interview with Sanctus Propaganda that cultural identity is an important part of any society. It grounds you, gives you a place, a meaning, a sense of belonging, in reference to the use of Celtic art in the band's visuals. This appreciation of cultural identity aligns with Jun's words in ID magazine, where he said, "I wanted to mix cultural and ethnic stuff to make humans equal for once," which likely explains why he specifically chose to reference sedition. Of course, Undercover isn't the only Japanese label famous for utilizing punk aesthetics around the 90s and 2000s. Junya Watanabe is known for incorporating the punk aesthetic into his work, which pairs very well with his mastery of deconstruction. Takahiro Miyashita's brand Number 9 is also heavily inspired by the American Pacific Northwest grunge scene, which is technically a subgenre or offshoot of punk. Takahiro visited Portland in his youth, which is where he gained such a love for the genre, and was specifically very inspired by Kurt Cobain. Grunge fashion has parallels with the punk look, as both have a focus on distressed clothes. Before we progress into some more modern examples of punk in fashion, we have to quickly take a trip to a different country, also known for its output of influential designers. Towards the end of the 20th century, Belgium was just shitting out groundbreaking designers. Seeing as this video is specifically about punk, we unfortunately won't be talking about this bloke called Mason, but we will be kicking it off with the chronically online male fashion fan favourite, Raf Simons. Born in Belgium in the late 60s, Raf grew up during the golden era of punk, and as a result became a big fan of the music and was involved in his local punk rock scene. For the most part, the connection to punk in Raf's work was through references to famous punk and post-punk bands, and would mostly come in the form of very blatant graphics, but there were some exceptions to this. To be honest, I don't think there's much more to unpack here, and let's be real, enough people on the internet have yapped about the significance of Raf's Autumn-Winter 2001 Riot collection, so let's just move on, as there is another Belgian fashion designer with a far more unique connection to the punk genre. Demeulemeester is a designer whose eponymous label was founded in 1985 and is also famous for being a part of the Antwerp Six. If you don't know who that group is, they are basically like the Avengers for insufferable nerds who are interested in fashion instead of superheroes. Her designs are famous for being elegant yet dark, and she is also one of the most highly regarded designers in the industry. The classic or UK punk look is definitely not what Anne is famous for referencing. However, the punk scene as a movement did influence her to some degree, especially in her early years while she was still a student. She said in an interview for Index magazine, "Punk had just started in London. Because Belgium is right in the middle of Europe, we felt its influence immediately. I was so inspired by punk. It made me feel revolutionary and strong. That has stayed with me." The majority of Anne's work is clearly inspired by proto-punk, post-punk and goth, which, surprise surprise, is also an offshoot of punk. However, what's unique about Anne is that one artist in particular has always been a muse for her. At the age of 16, Anne spontaneously bought a record of Horses by proto-punk artist Patti Smith after it caught her eye in the window of a local record shop. She listened to it and felt a deep connection between herself and the artist. When I was beginning to draw and make clothes, I tracked her down, which was not an easy thing to do, but I sent her a package. Patti Smith would recall, "Out of nowhere, one day comes this package. This exquisitely wrapped package, tied with black ribbons, and I opened it and found 3 beautiful white shirts inside, and I thought, whoever made them, whoever this person is, really understands me. It really felt as though they were made for me, and in a way, they were." The cover of Horses really set the tone for Anne's career in terms of the aesthetic. The dark, moody, and androgynous look is something we can see explored throughout her work. This did not turn out to be a one-sided parasocial fan situation like that of a Twitch streamer and their top donators. Patti Smith has claimed that she and Anne became not only friends, but sisters too. Since I began performing again after that first gift, I have never gone on stage without wearing a piece by Anne. All of Anne's clothes are significant. A jacket, a vest, a shirt, they are such a part of me. They make me feel confident, they make me feel truly like myself. Patti Smith would also say this about the Horses album cover regarding Anne. "When I look at it now, I never see me, I see us," which is a nice full circle moment. This section hasn't been massively relevant to the main focus of this video, as Demeulemeester's work doesn't really exude punk in the same way that, say, Vivienne Westwood or Jun Takahashi's work does. Yes, her muse is sometimes referred to as the godmother of punk, but Patti Smith has said she doesn't think of herself as a punk. However, in the same way punk has branched out and influenced so many different genres of music and artists that aren't even recognizable as punk anymore, the same could be said with fashion, with this being an example. I also think a relationship like that of Demeulemeester and Patti Smith is almost unheard of. Anne was initially just a teenage fan, but went on to influence and make up part of Patti's identity. Bar Vivienne Westwood, pretty much all the designers mentioned in this video follow the same formula of being a fan of punk bands and music artists and then using that as inspiration for their clothing collections, which go on to be influential within the confines of the fashion world. Demeulemeester, on the other hand, was inspired by an artist and then went on to influence said artist. Alright, now that you're caught up on a brief history of punk in the fashion industry, where does it stand in the modern era? Obviously, a lot of the designers I've mentioned are still working in the present, or at least their eponymous brands are still in operation, but what else is there to see from younger talent? This leads us to a very unique brand, Enfants Riches D. Yeah, if you think I'm doing the French accent, you can suck your mum. This brand's name translates to depressed rich kids and is known for ridiculous pricing and has with good reason been labelled as elitist punk, and exemplifies the crux of the subject that this video seeks to unpack. Henry Alexander Levi is the founder and creative director of the brand. He grew up in a world of wealth and opulence and attended multiple elite private boarding schools such as Institut Le Rosey in Switzerland. From a young age, Henry has been obsessed with punk, and the attitude of the subculture would inspire his behaviour throughout his teens as he was consistently kicked out of the expensive schools he was sent to. He would also develop issues with substance abuse, which landed him in an expensive rehab surrounded by depressed rich kids, which, as you can guess, helped inspire the brand, which was founded in 2012. It should be obvious to everyone that being born into the top 1%, enjoying a lifestyle that most people can't even fathom, and then claiming yourself to be a punk is questionable. He explains why he feels he is connected to punk in a complex interview, saying, "I'm angry at my parents for sending me to this place for a fucking year. I'm angry at the fucking people in the rehab for telling me what to fucking do all the time. I'm angry at my teachers and principals for kicking me out of every school I go to and not understanding me. That was for me my relationship with punk and that attitude." Henry clearly believes that this feeling is something unique to him. Apart from maybe the rehab stuff, this is what we call teenage angst, which is a common phase that most people go through in some form, but to Henry, he deemed this to be a groundbreaking form of rebellion and a way of authenticating his connection to a subculture which he proceeded to commodify. He's so obsessed with being authentic that it just comes across as him being insecure and painfully unauthentic. Yes, you can argue that he's not shying away from the contradiction of what he's presenting via the name of the brand, the egregious pricing strategy, and how he is open and sometimes obnoxiously proud of his privilege. But does that make him authentic, especially in the context of punk? This just reminds me of the age-old method of making sure no one can truly put you down or ridicule you for your insecurities by making sure you point them out and ridicule them first. Think of the stereotypical fat kid who makes loads of fat jokes about themselves. Does that mean they are happy about being fat? Is that a display of authenticity? I don't think so. The thing about ERD is that it could still exist, but instead of Henry needing validation as a real punk, he could simply reference the subculture like literally every other punk-related high fashion designer does. But that's not enough for him. He needs to be perceived as authentic. This isn't even a punk attitude at all. Like, surely he would just be unfazed by being labelled as inauthentic and just get on with it. Instead, he likes to talk about how authentic he is in interviews, which, yeah, is 100% something that someone known for authenticity would do. The way I live and what I do in my day-to-day, it feels like it's completely authentic. I want it to be understood. To add insult to injury, he also shits on other brands for doing what he shamelessly does with ERD. You see Diesel and all these brands doing these mock punk jackets, and they look super pussy. These aren't kids in the streets going to shows. These are people having a meeting about trying to make a line that looks punk. It's ridiculous. He can't even answer the most basic questions without being insufferable. In an interview with Vogue Italy, he's asked what his birthday is, which he responds with July 14th, 1991. The same day as the storming of the Bastille, which just comes across as him trying to convey himself as some sort of prophet of rebellion by associating himself to such a pivotal part of the French Revolution. You might say I'm reaching a bit with this one, but normal people born on that day don't bring that up unprompted when asked for their date of birth, and I know that for a fact, seeing as I was also born on the 14th of July. The only time I would ever mention it is to point out that if I lived in France, I would always have a day off on my birthday, seeing as it's a national holiday there. But then I would have to live in France, so I definitely dodged a bullet with that one. I can understand why Henry wants to be perceived in this specific way, because individuality and authenticity are like social currency within the world of fashion. This is true with both fashion designers and fashion consumers, and has been amplified by the advent of social media. For decades, it was considered cool to be on trend, but now everyone wants a specific and unique personal style. It's so common for people to hate on trends for the sake of it being trendy, and I think that is why we have all these cores now, because people want to artificially equate more meaning to trendy clothing items. It's not eclectic grandpa core, it's just wearing a cardigan. It's funny how this yearning for individuality and authenticity has been hijacked by platforms such as TikTok and has resulted in micro-trends in disguise as lifestyles or subcultures. Anyway, before we go any further, I just want to make it known that from a purely fashion design perspective, I don't think ERD is terrible or anything. Look at some of their most recent runway collections and campaign shots and you'll see good stuff, I'm not denying that. But this isn't really what gained the brand notoriety or represents its core values. ERD mainly gained popularity due to their controversial t-shirts. Personally, I believe if you want the authentic spirit of rebellion, I don't think buying an extremely overpriced Vivienne Westwood Seditionaries era t-shirt rip-off for the same price, if not more than an original Vivienne Westwood Seditionaries era t-shirt is the way to go. Better yet, you could probably make your own version for free or next to nothing. It's almost like there's a whole subculture based around this concept. As much as shitting on ERD is fun and a bit played out, and even though the core theme of the brand is undeniably tacky and cringe, in a very specific and abstract way I can see it being kind of punk. Don't get me wrong, this guy is not an authentic punk in the way he desperately wants to be perceived. But to a degree, I can see the commitment to the contradictory theme of elitist punk in a way is a form of nonconformity. He knows it's in poor taste and he does it anyway, and it pisses people off. I know I've just contradicted a lot of what I just said about ERD, but that also illustrates the paradox of punk specifically in fashion and leaves us with a lot of questions which can apply to more than just the work of Henry Levi. What is punk in the context of fashion? Can you even uphold punk values while operating within the fashion industry? The fashion industry, at least in a mainstream context, does represent a lot of what punk values stand against. Trends breed conformity and the industry relies on trends to shift products. Elitism is massively present and there is also the whole capitalism element. But on the flip side, this creates an environment where a bigger impact is made when someone subverts this and does something more aligned with or inspired by punk. a lot of the most highly regarded designers of all time fall into the category of anti-fashion, which has a lot of parallels and crossover with punk on a fundamental level. This clearly signifies that going against the grain and being subversive is highly valued within the industry, which is obvious in a lot of ways. Everyone wants to be ahead of the curve, creating or wearing the next trend while it's fresh and innovative, but eventually that needs to be commodified and sold to a larger audience to make it worth chasing. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the fashion industry wants to be punk to move forward, but at the same time needs to also be and represent the complete opposite to survive. I'll give an example of this. Rei Kawakubo is considered to be one of the most innovative and creative fashion designers of all time. She went against the grain, threw out the rulebook, and did high fashion her own way with Comme des Garçons. Her brand is also responsible for one of the biggest symbols of modern mainstream conformity in fashion. The CDG play Converse, which is now ridiculed and memed with the perception that if you wore them, then you are a sheep to mainstream trends, aka conformity. The anti-fashion powerhouse Comme des Garçons needs the CDG play diffusion line, which targets a mainstream audience to survive and carry on creating the cool stuff. In a way, this concept also applies to the popularization of punk in general. Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood represented the punk ethos, but also used it to very cleverly market their products and then later launch Vivienne's career as a high fashion designer. Is that really that much different from what ERD is doing? It's all a big grey area, especially as Malcolm and Vivienne helped to pioneer punk while also representing what it stood against. That now leads us to the question, what really is punk and the true ethos behind it, and how does it apply to fashion? Bar Vivienne Westwood and I guess Henry Levi, pretty much all the designers I've mentioned in this video simply reference punk. This then opens up a conversation that is very present online at the moment, being aesthetics or cause versus actual subcultures. I will try not to get completely sidetracked by this separate can of worms, but I think it very much applies to the punk fashion conversation as, for the most part, it is being taken and used as an aesthetic. I fully understand why this makes people angry, as it is pretty much commodifying something that's meant to be totally against commodification. However, this leads to people, especially on the internet, saying stuff like, "This person isn't punk, you don't understand it, you need to give credit, you're not allowed to wear that," which inadvertently leads to this person positioning themselves as an authority on the matter and trying to implement rules. Isn't that totally against what punk is about too? It becomes clear that any attempt to intellectualize or definitively categorize what is and isn't punk just leads to contradictions. Still, I don't think this makes punk completely flawed as an ideal or concept. If anything, it represents the fact of life that nothing is either black or white. We do not live in a world of absolutes. Everyone and everything is flawed in some way. Some people say punk is purely about non-conformity, but that gets muddied very quickly as what represents non-conformity one day will be a mainstream trend the next. Obviously, this is all just opinion-based and up to personal interpretation, but I guess that is the point. Punk means different things to different people. Some it's purely just an aesthetic, while other people see it as a lifestyle. In my opinion, I think what is at the core of punk and what truly matters to the subculture and the things it's influenced is the DIY ethos. I'm not alone on this take. For example, my dad, who was a teenager in the UK at the time of the Sex Pistols and the rise of punk, says the most influential and inspiring thing about punk was it made the youth at the time realise that they didn't need permission to do what they wanted to do. If you wanted to start a band, you didn't need to be deemed profitable by a label. You just did it, and it didn't matter whether or not you knew what you were doing or if you could even play the instruments. You were a rebel by simply following your artistic desires and using whatever resources you could get your hands on. It doesn't matter how you did it or if it was shitty, it was the fact that you were passionate and you did it on your own terms. With this in mind, I want to conclude this video by talking about a designer who I personally think truly embodies punk while still operating within the high fashion industry. So let me introduce you to the fashion alchemist, Boris Bidjan Saberi. Born in Munich in 1978 to an Iranian father and a German mother, Boris has stated that due to his family's quote, patchwork-like background, he never felt truly accepted into Bavaria's largely conservative community. You could say he grew up on the fringe of his community, which was further amplified by his alternative passions being skateboarding, climbing, hip-hop, and of course, punk rock. Boris started making clothes at a young age. In an interview with Style Zeitgeist, he explains how at the age of 14, due to his skinny build, many of the clothes he bought did not fit him in the way he wanted. So he bought second-hand garments and transformed them. Eventually his friends asked him to make them clothes, to which he said no, as he only knew how to make clothes for his own body and didn't even know where to start for someone else. Despite being formally trained in fashion later in his life, this style of what he calls 3D patterning, working straight on his own body, has remained central to his design process. I think once you've seen what Boris looks like and the types of cuts and silhouettes that he favours in his work, it all really makes sense. The clothes suit him a lot. His work obviously doesn't reference punk in the same way that the clothes by other designers in this video do. However, that's not to say there isn't any influence. He has stated that his clothes are informed by all his passions with, for example, the skinny silhouettes coming from the punk look. He describes his niche as, quote, a generation of skate punk hip hop culture. This is interesting to me as purely looking at his designs, his style could be described more as futuristic avant-garde with some techwear thrown in there. In fact, I think it's really hard to pin down a label as it's such a unique mix of influences and experimentation. Boris's punk influence comes more in the form of how he works rather than being apparent in his designs through direct cultural references. In fact, in an interview with Subject Change, he said, "The DIY aspect of punk and hip-hop, the sort of do not copy and be yourself, is something that is deeply ingrained in my way of thinking." Boris has found success with making clothes on his own terms, and part of this is rejecting mass production in favour of artisanal methods. At his Barcelona atelier, he employs around 30 people with nearly all the clothes produced under the label being made on site. He believes it is deeply important to transmit the importance of handmade objects to a newer generation. Yes, his clothes are extremely expensive, but that's due to him paying his employees an ethical wage, with all the garments being handmade with complex and experimental production methods. For a bit of context, in his interview with Style Zeitgeist, he explained that while a lot of brands sell trousers for say €90, that's around the same price he pays someone to do just the stitching on a single pair of his trousers. Basically, he's not marking up his clothes for a ridiculous price while also getting sued for unethical working conditions like other designer brands such as Christian Dior, or just doing it for the sake of artificial scarcity. Boris Bidjan Saberi clearly embodies the punk DIY ethos and has found success and fulfillment in doing so while rejecting mainstream ideals like scaling the business to mass production for profit's sake, or presenting at Paris Fashion Week in favour of being able to produce an untainted and authentic manifestation of his vision through clothes. For me personally, I think he is the truest punk designer operating in the high fashion industry, but for you, it could be someone completely different. Again, there is no one definition of punk, and this is all up to individual interpretation. That's the end of the video, goodbye.